Bring your cup and take a seat. Fill it up, coffee, wine, or tea. Come find what you're looking for. A good pour.
Hey there, and welcome back to A Good Pour Summer of Good AI. I'm Kathryn Good, and this episode is one I've been wanting to record for some time. The environmental and energy side of AI is a conversation I haven't seen enough people having, honestly, and today I finally got to have it. My guest is Madalina Buzdugan, an independent consultant who spent 15 years in startups and scale-ups before building a corporate sustainability department from scratch. She now runs keynotes and workshops helping businesses get intentional about AI through a sustainability lens. She's not anti-AI, and she's not an AI cheerleader. She's asking the questions that most of us haven't thought to ask yet. We get into the real environmental cost of AI use, why nearly a third of employees are actively working against AI adoption at work, and what a values-based AI policy looks like for small business. She shares 2 free browser tools to help you understand your actual AI footprint and a simple prompting technique that cuts energy use without cutting output. Come learn something new in this episode on this very important topic. We're just going to dive right in. I am so excited to have you. You definitely have a different voice when it comes to AI. You're not anti-AI, but you're anti-careless AI, which we just need to talk more and more about. But first, you spent 15 years doing sustainability work before you ever went independent. When personally did you start to see AI start showing up in your work and you just realized you could not ignore it, especially given your focus on sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent indeed the last 15 years in startups and scale-ups. So I'm very comfortable in the hyper growth spaces, in the do more with less resources, in the faster, harder, bigger is better, because we're all trying to make it to market, and we're trying to kind of get to that spot of success. And for me, AI, like for most of us, when it came to market as Gen AI. That's when I started kind of tuning in and basically getting a moment of, hey, what is actually happening there? What resources is it using? And I was coming at the end of my previous role, where I basically built up the Department of Corporate Sustainability from the ground up. So I was very fresh off of this uphill battle that a lot of sustainability professionals are actually ending up having to do, which is convincing, educating, showing what is the business case for sustainability, and in the same time doing the work itself, because that carbon footprint isn't going to make itself. That circular economy strategy isn't going to implement itself either. So when ChatGPT came to market and I started asking these questions, I noticed this big gap. We all had that big gap back then. It wasn't that we couldn't answer the question, it was that we didn't have the data for it. So very early on, I saw that there's an overlap that I find very interesting. And that's actually how you got me on the podcast. I know Tera from the generalist world. And I have this background of basically continuously looking at different intersections of things. First, it was communication and global mobility. Then it was the travel industry and go-to-market. Then it was the EV space and corporate sustainability. So it made a lot of sense for me professionally to start bringing in Gen AI from an ESG perspective altogether.
So Tara connected us, but I didn't realize you knew her. So that's such an interesting fact. So I'll have to thank her for sure. So you have a site on your website that says, or a phrase on your website, a sustainability strategy that ignores AI is outdated. An AI strategy that ignores sustainability is a liability. Will you walk us through that?
Yeah. So when I was working in corporate sustainability myself and I was doing the work, I was also looking around to see, okay, how is AI adoption going? What is happening with my people, with my peers? I'm very fond of sustainability managers. I think it's very common to be fond of your peers. So then I started looking and kind of seeing, okay, how are we adopting AI and how could it actually help us? And a big chunk of my work in my consultancy is actually working with sustainability managers on how AI can directly help them in their work, work, but also how it can help us get closer to sustainability goals and then higher up to, supporting our planetary boundaries. So in terms of keeping these two parallels separate, that's what I basically noticed. I noticed that within the industry of sustainability professionals, adoption was a bit slower. There was more reluctance. There was more, I'll look at that later. And I'll go back a few steps because it will make sense as well in the bigger kind of scheme of things. So sustainability has been having a bit of a harder patch for the last 2 years or so, with going into office and coming out of the climate agreements that the US was a part of, with a few important pieces of legislation that were supposed to go in practice and were supposed to be approved that were then pushed back and then they were watered down. That created a bit of a domino effect, and a lot of organizations were pausing on sustainability. So I understand, I genuinely have a lot of empathy for sustainability managers and directors and CSOs not having the space right now, because their teams were narrowing down, their scope was being cut, their responsibilities were being shifted towards compliance. And yet I thought, if we do not get at the forefront of this will be again something that we don't get to have a say in as part of the business function itself. So I do think, I want to be very clear, Gen AI itself cannot get us closer to climate goals.
Right.
That change and that push will come from different types of AI, right? It will come from predictive AI. It will come from machine learning. It will come from, knowing when to irrigate the soil so that we can actually make the most crops with the less amount of water that we have based on weather forecasts and kind of like predictive analysis. It will come from listening to illegal logging sounds in the Amazon and deploying rangers when that deforestation is happening. Those are very concrete climate examples in climate tech as well, where we use AI. However, if we keep on doing sustainability strategy in our organizations where we can have the biggest impact without taking AI into account, I do think we're going to put ourselves we're going to do ourselves a bit of disservice, and I don't really believe in kind of staying back or being left behind per se. I think that's a fear-mongering narrative, but I do think that it's best to be informed so then you can make the decision for yourself as a professional if you would rather use AI in your work or not.
Right. So I like that you bring up the domino effect. I wanted to get a little bit into what you're experiencing, in Europe and other parts of the world, because of decisions made in the United States. And it's also, as I've been looking at this or talking about this, I've met with some of our Congress people, and, there's not really any regulation coming anytime soon. And so, we have responsibility as people and businesses, to draw some lines or make some decisions on how we're going to use it. How have you seen that in business, or what are some decisions that we can just make or at least think through?
Yeah. I think we need regulation when it comes to AI. I know, as an European, I know exactly what the counter argument is, and that is that's too much red tape, and we need to go fast, and we need to go and, find innovation and drive it and all of that. And I'm not against that per se, but I do feel like we have reached, and I know we have reached the 1.5% degrees Celsius of warming, right, of global warming. We don't have the luxury of going ahead without any type of guidelines. We don't have the luxury of pushing fully, no matter the expense to the environment and the planet, and hoping that is going to bring us some innovation. So what we do have in Europe, I think that's quite known as well. We have the EU AI Act, which came through, which is a first good step. And it basically, although not actively enforced at the moment, because that also takes a lot of resources, it gives direction. Right? It brings the conversation back towards what is responsible, what type of fluency and literacy has to exist there, and what type of information do we have to put out there. However, it is also worth noting that there's a fair amount of mingling from the big AI players and not actually giving us all the information that we need so we can make informed decisions, both as businesses and as users. So and I'm happy to share a link with you afterwards, we have proof. We know that the big AI players have lobbied successfully with the European Union, with the National Commission, to not disclose the data center energy and water consumption, which begs the question of how are we going to move forward if we don't understand how it's going to affect communities, how it's going to affect the overall space locally, but also, is it again growth without any type of guardrails, and who's going to pay for that growth? And I don't only mean financially, of course, but in a bigger scheme of things, if we cannot see what we impact, how can we make the decisions about it?
Good stuff. So I
know it's not light. It's not light, the coffee conversation.
No,
either.
it is not. But it's
I'm fun at parties, I promise.
Well, I think we have to be aware, and we have to be aware, what's happening in other parts of the world, and what the impact of each other is, and the examples of things that are working. One of the things you talk about, which I just love, is this AI or die madness. Like if you don't do it now, you're going to be left behind. So it feels like you're helping companies kind of pause in this. So what does that look like? What is the conversation within a leadership team that you can help them through this? We do have to make decisions, but it doesn't have to be this frantic point of tension, I guess. What's the conversation you're having?
Yeah. So companies tend to come to me when they've already started the adoption and they kind of came to the first barrier, right? They came to the first kind of hiccup on the road. And that's when they don't necessarily know how to deal with the questions that are coming back from employees. A lot of those questions have to do with ethics, with governance, with the environmental impact, but also with the stability of their own jobs. So for me, what's really, really important, and I cannot stress this enough, is that this is not a blaming game in any way. This is not to point the finger at the users, at the employees, and say you're using AI too much. This is not even at the leadership of saying, hey, you kind of jumped ahead and you didn't consider exactly the impact of your choices. This is really to pause together, and I primarily work with keynotes and with workshops with teams that want to take sustainable AI principles into account. And it's a moment to pause and go back to the conversation. What is it that you're trying to adopt? What does success look like? And what type of impact are you comfortable with? Right? And then the conversation, of course, gets way, way deeper, because if you're comfortable with 10% of your carbon footprint being AI, that's a good point to start. It's very hard to calculate in itself because we still have so many gaps in data, but we can make some estimations. And then are you going to disclose it? Right? And those conversations, they basically allow companies to kind of move a little bit forward so they don't get stuck in, but where's my data going? But why should I use AI and train it if you're going to fire me a bit later? But why are we only doing this because we think that our competitors are doing it? And I'm sure you work with AI on a daily basis. I'm sure you've seen one of the studies that came out that basically says, I think it's 29% of employees are sabotaging actively the use of AI at work, and around 44% of Gen Z are also doing the same thing. So at the end of the day, similarly to corporate sustainability, similar to any kind of like technology that we get on board, it is also really change management.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of the adoption that we're seeing, and I'm sure you see the same in your work, is buying licenses, throwing them at people, and asking them to generate more output, whatever that output looks like. And
without proper training or policy or training on, even if they have a policy, a lot of people don't know what the policy says. It's a mess.
Yeah, it's super messy. And I think that's why I like my work so much, because it's a lot of mess, but also it's very clear when the parties start coming together. It's really clear when people, I talk about how to batch prompt, which is a very simple technique on how, instead of prompting whatever your LLM of choice, instead of prompting it 10 times in a row for one single task, you actually take a moment and you kind of put together 10 of those tasks, and how that simply uses less computing power, right? Because it doesn't have to fire up 10 times in a row. And you really can see how the spark in people's eyes opens up a little bit, and how it comes out to play, because they get to understand why and how agency actually comes back in their hands, and how actually the output can look like for themselves instead of, and for their companies and for their teams, instead of more, no matter what.
Yeah. What are love that. The other example that I've heard used a lot is just knowing which model to choose. So you're not, wasting a ton of energy on something that should be just a very low level model. Anything else like that just is really, really easy things that we can do?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that is very easy to take into account is to consider if you need the workflow or not. Right. So I'm going to send you the link afterwards. I started a series on LinkedIn that looks at intentional AI because I get a lot of questions about how can I take easy things. I don't have time to do a course, right? I don't have time to completely overhaul my workflows, but can I get a decision tree? So one of the things could be to, before you even open the LLM, to have a layer of intentionality for yourself. And those could be 3 questions, right? Who am I actually trying to target with this? Like, in whose name am I speaking? Is the work that I'm going to do going to impact somebody? Because then maybe I should pause and think if I want to use AI or not. You can also think about, do I already have something in place that I can use for this? Do I really need to use a large language model? And an easy way for that is, I know we all want to move away from Googling, but you can still try to make yourself to Google things instead of doing an AI search. And we have data that shows that the energy consumption for that, by comparison, can be up to 30% higher when we do an AI search. And it compounds very quickly. And another thing that is quite easy to use is to think about what type of apps and software applications you already have and what type of features you already have in place. So maybe you don't need another note taker because maybe you already have a sort of a transcript within the solution that you're using, right? So then that in itself helps a bit.
Yeah, I love that example. A lot of people have, for example, Google Workspace, and, they're using Gemini or could be using Gemini to record their meetings, but yet they have a Fireflies or an Otter going at the same time. And so you're basically duplicating the effort. And it's interesting now when I sign on to meetings, like I feel like there's 5 things yelling at me to record it. And I didn't sign up for any of those things. It's just already in the tools like Zoom or Descript even, that it's already there. And so it wants you to record and all of that. I mean, there could be companies using 5 different note takers, right? And so that's the education around the energy that it's consuming, but also just the mess it's creating on the back end because now you have 5 different transcripts, right?
Yeah. If you think about the cognitive load itself, I think that's also something that we can take into account as we move through the AI landscape. I think I even had this exact experience that you're describing yesterday, where I met 2 people for a call, and both of them, they didn't know each other, but both of them reacted with, wait a minute, AIs are screaming at me. I just want to talk to you. I don't want to do any of this. Give me a moment so I can close everything. And it also shows, again, we have data that shows that with AI kind of like dropping the barrier to entry when it comes to tasks that we can do, as a sustainability professional, you can vibe code. As a marketeer, you can build apps from scratch. We start so many more things at the same time because we can, right? Because the entry is much lower, the threshold is much lower. And at the same time, we go for much longer. So this proverbial plate that maybe some of us have been hearing about, which is the plate is going to get less busy so you can gain time back. So far, what we see from people's behaviors, and I'm definitely very guilty of this, the plate actually gets fuller and fuller. And we start conversations and projects from multiple devices. I know plenty of people who run their own projects overnight. And what that does is that it actually brings more cognitive fatigue. It brings more or less downtime altogether. So then when that happens, of course, the next step is that we make more mistakes. So while I understand the excitement, and I am definitely a cautiously optimistic AI evangelist or an ambassador, I do think that we have to take into account more when it comes to what is the intention behind it and what does success look like for that particular use case.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know I'm preaching to the choir.
Well, it's all good reminders, right? Even for me, I have started to say, okay, I did this to save time. And so if I am just spending more time on AI, even learning something or trying to figure out a new skill, I mean, there's stuff that drops every single day. And so I'm living in this time where I feel so far ahead of most people when it comes to AI, but so far behind when it comes to like, okay, well, now I have something else to learn and I have to go, why? Why am I learning this? What problem am I trying to solve? Have I already solved it with another tool? Or, what am I really trying to do here? And am I really saving time? Right? Like, and so I still have to have that boundary of if I want to work from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., like even if I have something going overnight, like I still need that boundary of why I even did this to begin with, if that makes sense. And the other thing I will say is I have to remember if let's just say I go to AI and I try to solve a problem that we have. And then 2 hours later, I have run out of time and I leave and go do something else. And then 2 weeks later, I'm like, oh, I never solved that problem. I can catch myself actually starting from the beginning instead of going back into that prompt or because I've just forgotten. I've forgotten where I left off or forgotten where the thread even was. And so, I talk to companies a lot about documenting who is doing what and how far it is. And because it is so easy to kind of chase squirrels and you're forgetting what squirrels you're even chasing.
Absolutely. And I definitely notice it as well for myself. One way that I keep myself in check when it comes, to example, to the tools that are coming out, right? I definitely feel the same pressure as you of keeping up to speed. And in the same time, I have to remind myself, Madalina, you do, ideally 50% of your business is sustainability strategy. It's decarbonization, it's electrification, it's looking at how we can make the overall strategy of the company more circular, right? That's what your focus is. And then the rest of it is sustainable AI keynotes, where you work directly with companies that are in the AI or die adoption process, but also are eager to bring in sustainability principles in place. And then one way that I do that, because that's where I started from, is that I keep these kind of lower carbon footprint tools at hand. So then whenever I feel the sparkly shine of a new tool that I would like to turn out to and try it out, I go back to the tools that I know and I'm like, hey, could I do it on any of these, right? Is this just another shiny agent? And do I actually need to use an agent for this? And I'm definitely a big fan of try things out, figure out how to do an agent, see if it makes your life easier, and then bring intentionality into place so that you don't feel like you're missing out, which I think can be a very strong demotivator for people in the workplace. But in the same time, you can keep your ownership and your agency close to yourself, because at the end of the day, we don't all have to use AI for every single task of the day. That in itself is also a dystopia.
Yeah. Really, really good points. While I have you, can you cover some of the misconceptions about the environmental cost of AI?
Yeah. So we know very little so far. And I'm going to make a parallel with climate change, because I think that can also really help a lot. So we have this thinking of, data centers are, I think at this moment, 1% to 2% of overall emissions globally. And we have bigger industries that consume so much more. And to that, I say, yes, absolutely. And while it's important to keep things in context, we haven't seen such an exponential growth in a very long time. So one myth would definitely be this idea that Gen AI is going to bring us closer to solutions when it comes to climate, whereas we see that the papers that we have so far do not show that. Right? So that's not where innovation is going to come from. Another myth that we have is the numbers that have come out of OpenAI, and I believe also Google came out with them, and they were using particular numbers to say, this is how much one query would actually cost us in energy use and electricity. That's also a myth, because they've never published those numbers, so we cannot verify them. So I would highly gently ask people, but also companies, to bring those questions back to the suppliers that they're actually working with. And I think especially on a corporate level, that can be very powerful. I've recently been in a vibe coding workshop, and I saw it was, we were 300 people there, And I saw people in the chat literally being like, when are you going to release your carbon footprint? I want to know how much it takes me to actually build this app. I want to be able to make the choice if I'm going to deploy it or not. So I think that's also the myth that we as individuals, we cannot do that much, which is the parallel with climate change, right? We thought we cannot do that much ourselves. We can. We can ask for transparency. We can ask for disclosure. And the other myth, there was a number that was going around the internet. I believe it was that one query takes around half a liter of water because of the data centers in terms of like how much water is needed to actually cool off the data centers. That also seems to be a myth, and we simply cannot really indicate how much more or how much less. So I would urge people to keep things in context and to be, to ask the right questions, but don't take the blame on yourselves, because I think that's also something that can very, very easily transform into, I'm a bad person because I use AI and I hate it, whereas we can actually need to turn the lens on what regulation do we have in place? What are the big players doing? Why are they not disclosing the information that we need so that we can make informed decisions?
Yeah. So it feels like, I've been in this space, almost 3 years, I guess, and teaching for 2. I have something called what I just called kind of AI journey. And it was, it started with naysayer and 2 to 3 years ago, they didn't understand it, or they were fearful of it, or, it was from the devil sort of comments. And then I saw less and less naysayers in the room. And now we're seeing more and more, which I think is good and healthy. And we, of course, in the United States are seeing protests to data centers. And again, I think that's healthy. I think it's a way to use our voice so we can understand when there's not a whole lot of understanding being done through regulation or kind of this education, if you will. What are you seeing there, or what is your kind of impression on what's happening in the United States as the negative AI talk picks up? As someone who is not anti-AI, what are your feelings on what you're hearing?
I think it's an overcorrection. I think what's happening in Memphis, where you have this lawsuit that is happening because they could directly correlate the pollution coming from the data center to the health of the people in the community. I think that's very unfortunate, and I'm really glad that the community found the resources they needed to actually go to court for that. And I'm hoping that's gonna shake off the data center opacity that we're seeing. In terms of the overall anti-AI sentiment, I do think it's an overcorrection right now because we knew so little, and then we had this exponential growth. And then, if you look at how the money flows in the AI industry, what you see is, a handful of companies, maybe 7 in total. So people are starting to understand and connect the dots. And also, a lot of companies have been doing adoption in a rather forceful way of, this is it, jump on board, and no collaborative type of efforts. So it makes sense to me that people are now saying, wait a minute, because we've seen the titles, right? We've seen the news for the last 2 years. We've seen what happens in the name of AI, which is also a narrative that is, not necessarily fair, because a lot of the times when layoffs are happening, they're not necessarily because AI has become so much more efficient that they don't need those employees, but rather because companies actually need the extra budget for extra, computing power to buy extra chips and so on. So to me, as an average human living her life, it makes sense. It makes sense that there's so many moving pieces. There's push and there's pressure from a variety of areas in our lives outside of AI, and also politically, but also economically. So it makes sense that people are kind of like overcorrecting and saying, no, enough is enough.
Yeah, really, really good point. So there's lots of different people that are going to be listening to this, a lot of small business owners, nonprofit leaders. They don't have a sustainability department. A lot don't even have an AI policy yet. They're just trying to keep up. What would you say is a really good starting point for them?
Yeah, use an AI model that is smaller. So maybe you don't need an LLM, maybe you need an SML, so an SLM, so a small language model. That will, for most of the use cases, it will already give you the results that you need. So that can already be just a very conscious choice from the beginning.
What is an example of that?
Yeah, so there's GreenPT.
Okay.
There's Vero AI. And then there's Taura. And there's also Smol, spelled SMOL.
Okay.
Small as in a cute way. And I think there's also Gemma. I forget the numbers of it, but also there's one model that's called Gemma. And if you just look for the lighter model, that also is going to come up.
Okay.
So that for most of us, for me particularly, I use one of these models. I toggle through them throughout my week because they're good enough with the context that I give them for the daily tasks that I use AI on. The other thing, when it comes to the policy itself, I would urge people to spend 2 hours with whoever is in your business and define what is a go and what is a no-go. Define on paper what is your voice, define what is the value or the values that you want to take into account, and make that at the forefront of your adoption, whatever that means. Clarify for yourselves, what do we care about? What do we value? What does success look in our business? So really kind of go back to the basics, because then it's going to be really easy to write your policy. It's going to be very easy what is good use of AI and what's bad use of AI.
Yeah.
So if one of your values is treat customers as friends or help people no matter what, then you might have a hard time choosing to completely automate your entire customer support flow, because it's hard to treat people with extra kindness and friendliness if nobody is in the lead from a human perspective, right? So you might even not have the conversation. You'll be like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Look at our values. And there's so many hurdles down the road that you're simply gonna avoid like a pro, because especially as a small business, you know exactly what you stand for. Right? You know exactly what is important to you, because it's so hard to be a small business.
Yeah. I have an arts organization that I'm doing some consulting for, marketing. My primary business is marketing, but I'm doing marketing consulting with them. But then, they know I teach AI, so I'm doing a co-pilot training because they are already in Microsoft.
Yeah.
But being an arts organization, they have lots of concerns, that we don't create art using AI, for example. So when I was doing the training, it was really important to hear from people what their concerns were. And I think that goes back to your comment on change management. If we don't know the concerns from our organizations, the people in our organizations, it's going to be really hard to adopt in small ways that really could save time, or that are aligned with theid values, if we don't hear people from the beginning. And like I said, I think that goes back to your change management conversation, but it just really shined a light on taking the time to understand people's concerns, and how do we make our policies better because we've heard those concerns.
Yeah, I did a workshop. I did an online session with somebody who, her name escapes me because otherwise I would give her a shout out. She did a beautiful job of helping us to write our human manifesto, which, can be a fun exercise. It can also feel a bit silly because, what do you mean? We're humans, all of us. I don't have to write something to prove that I'm human. But it was also a really nice pause in the business of every day to kind of remember, what do I stand for? And what are the things that I envision for myself moving forward? Because as you said, maybe I want to work 10 to 4, right? And that means that efficiency in that format has to do with how many hours I work per week. Yeah. I definitely see it a part of my audience is sustainability managers, like I mentioned, and I run workshops on fluency and literacy for them particularly, because I want to give back to the community. And I remember how people were generous with me when I was getting started as a sustainability manager. And that's also a very interesting space to kind of see, where does it land on top of the rest of the responsibilities? Because I think that's also something that we don't talk about quite a lot at the moment, or if anything, if at all. And that is, on top of a full-time job, if you are asked to adopt a new technology with no structure whatsoever, that cannot not be messy. But if you're then asked to completely bring up the efficiency to create the workflows, but also bring up the efficiency of your workflows without any guidance on how that lands for you as a human, then that again can create a lot of internal conflict, but also team conflict. And I see it's very interesting in these workshops where, the manager will be very pro AI, and then the reporting person will be like, why would I ever do that? Like, my job is talking to people and getting the data and making sure that the data is correct and reading in between the lines of how that data actually reached us from suppliers. Why would I even automate that? That's all knowledge in my head. Like that I'm not willing to do that. Yeah. So indeed, I think getting that space to kind of as always, to get the opinions in, but also to understand how some things cannot be automated, or if they can, it's 30% of automation, but not 100.
Yeah. We talk about core values a lot in marketing and just knowing those. So from the beginning, like you said, back to the basics of knowing your core values before you knowing them, operating in them, and then using them to apply your policy, I think is really, really smart. If there's anything else you can think of, maybe just somebody's listening to this and they do one thing differently this week, what would you want that to be?
There's 2 plugins that you can sign up for yourself as, don't use it to judge yourself, but use it to understand a bit of your impact and then bring it to your team and have a chat about it. There's one that's called AI Impact Tracker. I'm not affiliated with these. They're tools that I use myself. And that's a browser extension. It works primarily on ChatGPT. And the other one is AI Watch with double T, so AI Watch. They're both independent. They both explain the methodology, and they both refer particularly to energy use. I think AI Watch also looks at water. But what's very interesting is that it also gives you your own impact also in parallels and by converting it to daily actions. So it will tell you use enough energy today as the equivalent of charging your smartphone 15 times.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's quite nice, because then you can have conversations as a team. You can run this for a month and then come back and say, okay, guys, we used enough energy with our AI usage on ChatGPT, on Claude, on Gemini to power up 3 households, 24/7. Are we okay with that? And the answer can be yes. The answer can be, hey, we achieved so much more as a team of 3 people that is a risk that we're fine with, and we're actually going to invest a bit more in a reforestation project because that's how we want to compensate for that. Sure, not ideal, but at least and you can position yourself in it. It is complicated on a corporate level, I'm not going to lie. I am currently working on an approach that we can do an estimate, because even Microsoft, for example, they have all of this access to the data. We know exactly where their data centers are. They know exactly, the location, but also the energy mix. However, for Copilot, they don't publish that information. So it's hard to estimate. But I think in time, with this exponential growth that we're having, it's only a matter of time. And under the EU AI Act, you do have to disclose that information, right? You do have to disclose that usage in your overall carbon footprint. So in time, I think that's going to become more and more of a requirement. I think it can be really useful to do it now when the pressure is maybe a bit lower, because we live in different parts of the world, we're exposed to different regulations, and it can potentially have some good conversations happening.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thrilled that you are able to join today. I think it's a really neat space you're in that you've really created for yourself, because they're almost opposite. It seems like sustainability and AI, right? But
I get that very often.
We have to have these conversations.
Yeah.
And like I say, take responsibility ourselves and in our businesses. And so I'm glad you're not just, I think there's many people in your space that are anti-AI, and I think you can really help us all in being both, right? And not that you are exactly for AI, but you can see the benefits and what is needed to help us do this better. And that's what this conversation, this entire series is about. So your voice is really invaluable to me in this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Can I shoot a question back at you?
Sure.
Do we still have time?
Yeah, do.
I would be really curious to hear, what was your kind of first thought when you heard, hey, I know this person who works on sustainable AI. What was the first thought that you had when you heard sustainable AI? Because I think it's a relatively new term, and I'm always curious to hear how people kind of perceive it at the beginning.
So I think my first reaction is, does that exist?
Fair.
And then it was immediately, I have to talk with her. So it is, it's similar to ethical AI and like, who defines this and what are the responsibilities that I have to take? That's, we want to teach our kids, for example, how to use ethical AI. But do we know what that is yet? Who gives the stamp of approval on the framework that we are teaching? So I have a lot of thoughts when it comes to this idea of ethical AI, and I immediately had similar thoughts when it comes to sustainable AI. And to be frank, you and I get to set those frameworks or at least create them for ourselves and teach them to other people, because no one's really doing it. And so, I admire your work here, because someone has to create some sort of education and framework around this, and then someone has to teach it, and you're doing those things. And so I applaud you, but it's also, how do we get more people? Again, I was at a party and I had created this app to go with the book club thing, and maybe that's not responsible AI, but it was just fun and to show people, one, what could be done. But then I also talked about, we don't want to just share this with everybody, because I don't, that's it's fun for us to do it together as a group and community. But if everyone starts using this, is that responsible? And I shared, with the energy consumption and that sort of thing. And a couple people looked at me and they were just like, I have not even thought about energy consumption when it comes to AI. So it just tells me that we're so early in some ways, and we are trying to overcorrect, but it's also, there's plenty of people that have no idea what ethical AI is. There's plenty of people that don't know what sustainable AI is. And again, someone has to do this work. And so glad you're doing it.
Yeah. It reminds me of, so there was this marketing campaign, I'm sure you've heard about it as well. I think it was run by BP. It was one of the first kind of like big oil advertisement campaigns. And it was so successful that it actually transferred the ownership from kind of overall carbon footprint from corporations to actually individuals. So it made us take into account and evaluate higher the importance and the accountability for our own personal carbon footprint, which then creates guilt and shame and kind of like, feeling at unease with your choices, feeling uneasy about them. And I think that's, for me, one of the kind of parallels that I like to bring forward. The intention on my side with the conversation on, the intersection between AI and sustainability, sustainable AI as a concept, is never going to be what is your own personal, carbon footprint on AI usage. It will always be on the company side of things, right? Because that's where the big decisions will then affect all of us. So then maybe to leave with one last thing, and that would be, very rarely you need the most performing model on the market. Try it out, have a kick, have a good laugh, and then intentionality comes also from practice, of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Enjoyed this conversation. Appreciate the work you're doing. And you have a book, right? You're working on a book?
I do. Yeah, I'm writing a book which is relatively different from what I'm doing for work. So I'm writing a book which is called The Tired Overachiever. It is a sarcastic self-help book. I write about 10 global challenges for millennials and Gen Z, one of them being climate change anxiety, one of them being sustainable AI. But I also write about economic instability, job volatility, access to healthcare, access to education, mental health, gender inequality. And they're all essays written in a way where we look at the systems instead of looking at personal guilt. And then each of the chapters has an interview with a normal person like you and me, and how we deal with those challenges to kind of take the voices back and kind of see how people go through that.
Yeah. What is the timeline for that?
This year. It has to go out. It has to go out. I have to say, running your own business has consumed my brain to a capacity that I didn't know that I can work this hard. I've always been a very hard worker, but I didn't know I can work this hard. My intention is to get it out this year.
Well, good luck. I can't wait to see what's next for you. And again, thank you for joining this conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Kathryn.